is an MS Views Now program. This program began, the series name began at the beginning of COVID when we were relating multiple sclerosis with COVID and the pluses and the minuses going forward. And that's no longer the case. So now we just do important aspects of multiple sclerosis, as which we are doing tonight. And for those that don't know me, there I am, a younger version. You can tell by the hair, right? All right, so yes, tonight's sponsors, we have Genentech and we have Sanofi. We want to give them a virtual round of applause. Hey, virtually. Okay, awesome, thank you. All right, and tonight we have Dr. Stephen Krieger, and Dr. Stephen Krieger is a very, very well-known MS neurologist, and you know, his name is known in circles throughout the globe. So I'm really glad that he has time to be with us, to be online tonight, and I thank him for that. I thank him for all the work that he does. Again, he is not the rural America guy. He is in urban New York City, and tons of resources available for people with multiple sclerosis. And to have a doctor like Stephen Krieger, well, you know, sometimes it's worth it to get on a plane and go see him. Dr. Krieger is going to speak with you tonight about MS disease progression. All right, he's not going to use slides. He's going to talk to you in a way that you're going to see what it is that he's talking about. But Dr. Krieger, here you go. Take it away. It's all yours. I'm gone.
Stuart, I appreciate it. I appreciate the invitation to come and talk to all of you about MS progression. It's in some ways the hardest conversation, the hardest topic. And so I want to try to do justice to it. And, you know, as Stuart said, I'm going to talk to you guys for a while, and then I'm here for questions. So if you put your questions in, Stuart will go through them, and then we'll talk about those in the second half of the time together. But, you know, I thought about it, and when Stuart asked me to come and speak to you all about MS progression, you know, I initially thought about what the slides would show and how to put together the whole talk. And then I thought, you know, you've seen a million talks and slides. Instead, I would approach this in a way unlike any talk I've given, honestly, which is to have no slides, no crutch, nothing to rely on, but talk about it more as I would or as I do with my own patients, the people with MS that I take care of, as though we're sitting in a room together, talking about MS progression, in a sense, kind of facing the enemy, facing what we are trying to stop and forestall and learn more about. So I'll jump right into it and say that progression in MS, no matter how you define it, is our call to action. It's the reason why we in our field do almost everything that we do. We have many treatments for relapsing MS, but the goal has never been just to prevent relapses. As anyone who has had MS or who's ever had relapses knows, relapses are unpleasant, they can be disabling, they can be frustrating, they're unpredictable, but they are self-limited. A relapse might go on for days or weeks and then improve. But if all we were doing with all of our MS medicines and MS therapies were just preventing those few bad days or few bad weeks, that wouldn't really be our call to action. The reason we do what we do is to prevent progression. It's to prevent something that is more insidious and more permanent, and to try to slow that down. And I will say it's been one of the great challenges and remains one of the great unmet needs in our field. And so I want to approach this conversation from that vantage point, to say right up front, MS progression is the enemy. It's something that we incompletely understand. It's something that I think neurologists have not always completely or thoroughly assessed or recognized. So to any of you who have felt that you are worse, that your disease is progressing or has progressed, and the neurologist has said, well, I don't see anything. I don't see any change. You both can be right. The neurologist may look as carefully as she or he can, clinically, with the physical exam, or with imaging, with the MRI scans, and we may not be able to see it. That doesn't mean it's not happening, and it doesn't mean it's not real. And I think that that's something that we as a field and neurologists and MS specialists are finally coming around to understand. So let's talk a little bit about how we define progression, how we think about it. So the language of multiple sclerosis disease has been about relapses and about progression. And relapses, again, defined as these relatively short-term events lasting days or weeks, whereas progression has been defined as a more gradual, slow accumulation of disability. And what we have meant by progression and disability in the world of MS has really focused a lot on things like ambulation, walking. How far and how well can someone walk? Do they need support to walk, like a cane or a walker? Or do they need a wheelchair to go longer distances? Or does someone need a wheelchair to get from any point A to any point B? Those are kind of the metrics that neurologists have used for MS progression for many years, focused a lot on gait and walking. In our multiple sclerosis clinical trials, the scale that's used to judge physical function or disability is the EDSS scale. The EDSS scale has been used in trials for 40 years, and it is really based on the physical exam, the neuro exam. So when you see the neurologist and she asks you to touch your nose and touch a finger and wiggle your fingers and check reflexes and strength, what we're looking for there are findings that we can sum up and give it a number on this EDSS scale to grade disability. And as I said, as disability worsens in MS, it has usually been looked at regarding gait, walking, and walking assistance. What's missing there? Well, what are some of the most common symptoms of all in multiple sclerosis? Fatigue, cognitive dysfunction, problems with thinking, memory, judgment, finding words. Pain can be a common pervasive symptom. But those three things, fatigue, cognitive dysfunction, and pain, well, most neurologists would not have called those things relapses, and we probably would not have called those things progression. So three incredibly common, potentially severe or even disabling symptoms in multiple sclerosis don't fit neatly into the two ways that neurologists look at the disease. Is it relapsing or is it progressing? And yet those things are incredibly important. So I start there to say, in some ways, the neurology community, the multiple sclerosis community, has missed it for years. And I think one of the things that we are trying to do as a field, what we're trying to do as individual clinicians and doctors, is to look more carefully, to listen harder and listen better, to try to capture some of those symptoms. Now we refer to those things as patient-reported outcomes. Many of you may have filled out surveys and questionnaires or participated in studies or done trials where patient-reported outcomes are being captured. I say it with a smile, a little bit facetiously, because it's nice that the field, the scientific field, finally gave a name to it, patient-reported outcomes. But you know, what we've been hearing all this time is the patient's story, the patient's history. Those have always been patient-reported outcomes. It's just we haven't always known how to capture them and what to do with them. So the clinical science of approaching progression is changing to be more inclusive of the actual lived experience with the disease. Now, I talk about relapses and I talk about progression. Many of you, I'm sure, know the terms relapsing remitting MS secondary progressive MS, or primary progressive MS. Those categories historically over the last 25 years or so have been used as though they're very discrete things, as if someone who has relapsing remitting MS could not have progression, as though someone with primary progressive MS could not have a relapse, or what we call disease activity, new lesions, for instance. And secondary progressive MS has always been the category that combines the two. Someone who used to have relapses, but now more so has a gradual worsening of disability or physical findings. In truth, the way I come to think about multiple sclerosis is that those categories are useful for clinical trials and for science. But real life with MS is that everyone with MS has all of those things to different degrees. Some folks have relapsing MS and they've only ever had relapses. There's nothing overt or obvious to imply that there's progression, and that's a good situation to be in. Some people who have secondary progressive MS may have been developing worsening and progression for a long time, and they may or may not still have new relapses or new lesions on a scan. And people with primary progressive MS, well, their story has usually been without relapses, without that kind of hallmark of MS, but it's the same disease. It's the same disease that can accumulate disability more gradually. So we've made enormous progress in treating the relapsing part of this disease, but we haven't always made such great strides forward in treating progression. Now, I said at the beginning that progression is the reason for everything that we do. And part of that comes to the fact that there are certain things that seem to predict who with MS is going to have progression or who is more likely to progress and develop disability. It's people who have had many relapses early on, relapse after relapse after relapse. That person's prognosis to have more disability is more concerning. It's the person who has many, many lesions on a brain MRI or on a spinal cord MRI. Even if someone with MS looks good early in the disease, has very little, if any, physical findings, if there are many lesions there at the beginning, that concerns us that that person's prognosis towards progression might be more concerning. And so why do we use all of our disease-modifying therapies early? Why has there been an emphasis on more effective medicines, higher efficacy medicines for MS? It's not just to prevent relapses, and it's not just to prevent lesions. It's because those relapses and those lesions leave damage behind. And that damage can go on and become the cause of progression later. The more damage that's accumulated early, the greater the likelihood is that someone with MS will go on to progress and have more disability down the road. I've encapsulated that idea that early relapses and lesions, even if they're under the surface, not causing anything obvious, nonetheless are there. And that if reserve drains over time, as we get older, all of that damage can show itself as progression. I've encapsulated that idea as something called the topographical model of MS, what some folks have called the leaking pool model. That's my friend Aaron Boster's name for it. So if you're interested in that, if you Google topographical model multiple sclerosis with or without my last name, Krieger, you'll see it. You can have a visual to go along with this. But that idea that by preventing relapses and lesions, we can keep the disease quiet and prevent progression years or decades later, that's a little bit of our North Star. That's why when we treat someone with a disease-modifying therapy, I tell her, I'm not treating you for who you are and where we're at now. I'm treating you for who you will be in 10 years, in 20 years, in 50 years. You know, someone who's 22 with newly diagnosed multiple sclerosis, she has a lot of decades left on this planet. So the decisions we make early to use effective medicines, often more highly effective medicines early on, is to prevent that damage that can reveal itself as progression years or decades down the road. Now, we've made enormous progress in MS in the last 30 years. This is the 30th anniversary of when MS became a treatable disease. 30 years ago in 1993, the very first medicine for MS was successful in a clinical trial and got approved, interferon beta, followed by medicine after medicine after medicine over the next couple of decades. That initial success sort of paved the way for how we could study MS and show that medicines actually do something, that they actually change the course of the disease. This is why we call them disease-modifying therapies, because we're trying to change the trajectory. So we've had great success at preventing relapses and lesions, but what we've not had such great success for is once someone has evidence of progression, they've worsened year over year or years over years. We don't have an enormous amount of evidence that our medicines slow that down. We have a little bit of evidence, but it's a little bit underwhelming. There have been 2 clinical trials that have happened in the last few years that have been clearly successful. One of them was for ocrelizumab, which succeeded in primary progressive MS at preventing additional disability. But it didn't succeed by a lot. It helped to prevent some disability, but both the people who received ocrelizumab and the people who received placebo in that trial, the majority of them still got worse as the years passed. So the drug definitely does a brilliant job at preventing relapses and lesions, and it did a modest job of slowing down primary progressive MS. There's real debate in our field as to whether we should be using ocrelizumab for people with secondary progressive MS. It was effective in relapsing remitting MS. It was effective in primary progressive MS. So it stands to reason it should be effective in people who, in essence, have a mixture, relapses and progression. But it's never been studied in folks with secondary progressive MS, not in a randomized trial to really prove that it works. And so it's hard to be sure. So that's something that MS specialists debate about, the relative wisdom of using ocrelizumab for people who are progressing with secondary progressive MS. The second trial that was clearly successful was a trial of a medicine called siponimod, which is a pill which was studied in a trial looking at secondary progressive MS, comparing people who were worsening with disability gradually. Half of them got the drug siponimod and half of them got placebo, and siponimod helped to prevent further accumulation of disability. It was a successful SPMS trial. Again, though, not enormously successful, modestly successful. And the FDA, when they reviewed this, decided, in fact, it was most successful for people still having MS disease activity, new lesions or relapses. So they ended up approving it not for secondary progressive MS as a class, but for relapsing forms of MS. In my mind, though, and perhaps this is because we did those clinical trials at Mount Sinai for both of those medicines, I use ocrelizumab for folks with primary progressive MS. I use siponimod for people with secondary progressive MS because that's where we saw the benefit. But those benefits were modest. Some of the challenges that we've faced over these last several years is that many other strategies to try to stop progression have seemed promising. They haven't quite worked. There's a trial of a medicine or it's sort of a vitamin, a modified vitamin called high-dose biotin, was studied for progressive MS. Didn't have the benefit that we hoped it would. It's a study done of an entirely different molecule called ibutylast. It's a medicine that modifies the immune system and other cells in kind of a subtle way. And that was a trial of both primary and secondary progressive MS combined into one study, which I personally think is a good way to do it. If we're going to say that progression is progression, let's put people together and study a broader group to look for benefit. That study showed that ibutylast seemed to slow down brain atrophy, but it didn't have an obvious benefit clinically. It didn't slow down obvious clinical progression. But the MRI finding there is tantalizing. It shows us that perhaps this drug is doing something in the central nervous system. There have been a lot of other studies of other agents that have similarly been a little underwhelming. Even what people view as sort of the holy grail treatment, stem cells, stem cell medicines, stem cell strategies that involve immune suppression and then giving the stem cell transplant, have been effective in people with very active, inflammatory, relapsing MS. Because in truth, what those sorts of hematopoietic stem cell trials are doing are blasting the immune system with chemotherapy type drugs, knock out the immune system, and then put back an immune system with stem cells. So knocking out the immune system is very useful when someone's MS is really being driven by active inflammation. And that's what we think of as relapsing disease. When somebody has had long-standing MS with progression, they're not having new lesions, but they're getting worse gradually over time, even super powerful immune suppressants like stem cells haven't been nearly as helpful. And so we never recommend that strategy for folks with progression, not because they don't need something, not because we don't want passionately to stop that progression or to slow it down, but because knocking out the immune system doesn't seem to be the way to do it in folks with that form of the disease. So we've struggled as a field with how can we have had such great success for relapsing MS and have so much of that success over the last 30 years fall away when it comes to treating progression. This is something that my mentor and colleague Fred Lublin and I wrote about in a recent paper in the Multiple Sclerosis Journal on this 30th anniversary of MS being a treatable disease, how far we've come, but how far we have left to go in understanding progression itself if we're going to be able to target it effectively. Although that paper in the Multiple Sclerosis Journal, MS 30 years on from being a treatable disease, although that paper is firewalled at the journal, they didn't make it publicly accessible, I put a Twitter thread about it on my Twitter feed with a bunch of screenshots of it. Probably half the paper is there and my summaries of it if you want to look at it. On Twitter, it's S. Krieger, MD. But that tells us how far we've come and how much we need to do further. But let me get into a couple more specifics here about what we think progression is and how we can better look at it. If you look at recent papers in the multiple sclerosis field, there has been a lot of consternation about whether to think about MS as different types of the disease, relapsing, remitting, secondary progressive as separate, or whether to combine these together. My view with the topographical model has been to combine them together and think about new lesions as one enemy and the loss of reserve as the other enemy, and that these two things conspire together to cause, progressive MS. Recent papers have also taken that approach, but they're looking at it in a more so-called mechanistic way. How can we understand the disease mechanisms at a cellular level that seem to drive these different processes? So a paper that came out this past year, which was authored by the National MS Society Working Group on this problem, on tackling progression, was authored by Tanya Kuhlman and colleagues, and points out that what we need is to really understand the mechanism drivers of progression. Which are the cells that are responsible? How do they behave? which are the ways that the immune system and the central nervous system interact with each other, that seems to damage the brain and the spinal cord irrevocably, that leads to progression. How can we design molecules, design medicines that can get across the blood-brain barrier from the bloodstream into the central nervous system where the damage is happening? In essence, all of our, or most of our, relapsing remitting drugs work in the bloodstream. They work in the immune system. They are not actually themselves getting into the brain and the spinal cord to a large degree to try to stop the damage from happening there. And so the next generation of MS immune medicines are going to be drugs that don't simply work in the bloodstream, but rather ones that can actually get across that blood-brain barrier and get into the nervous system. The blood-brain barrier is designed to keep everything out of the brain. It prevents toxins from getting to our nervous system. It prevents infections from getting across into our nervous system. And it blocks other molecules like medicines from getting across into the central nervous system. Any medicine that is a so-called large molecule, like an antibody. An antibody is a huge structure as these things go, much too big to get across that really tight filter of a blood-brain barrier. So instead, what we need are smaller molecules, molecules that can actually traverse through that filter of the blood-brain barrier, get in to the central nervous system, and target some of the cells that we think are crucial players. So for many years in MS, we've talked about lymphocytes, white blood cells, their various types, like B cells and T cells, because we can target those. We can measure them in the blood. But a whole new class of cells of interest are now kind of the focus of research in multiple sclerosis. And those are cells within the central nervous system called microglia. Microglia, you can kind of think of as resident immune cells within the central nervous system, local players that are involved in regulating the immune and inflammatory response. They also have a lot of so-called crosstalk between the cells of the nervous system themselves. They are around them and permeate within the central nervous system. And so those cells seem to play an important role in why, when inflammation gets into the central nervous system, it keeps going there. They activate that inflammatory fire, if you will, and are involved, we think, in causing ongoing damage within lesions and within the central nervous system. By damaging those myelin cells, they sort of suck up debris. They're active in an inflammatory way. And there are these novel ways of doing some neuroimaging that could potentially show this to us. Not things that are really available in standard practice, but ways of using modern imaging techniques to see those areas of inflammation and ongoing damage that we think are being caused by microglia. So these are things such as iron rim lesions, where MRI scans can be designed to look for little rims of iron around a lesion, which suggests that there's active damage happening to those cells. We can also use other MRI techniques to see lesions that are enlarging very slowly. We tend to think of lesions as being scars, and scars are quiet. Scars don't change very much. But some lesions within the central nervous system do seem to be chronically inflamed, chronically active, enlarging over time. And using a whole new set of modern MRI techniques, one of the ideas there is to home in on those enlarging lesions, to zoom in on them and see whether there's ongoing inflammatory activity. All of this would be just for interest's sake if it didn't relate specifically to treatments. So why are we thinking about the role of activated microglia in progression? Why are we targeting them with new imaging sequences like these ones I'm talking about with rim lesions and enlarging lesions? We're thinking about that because those cells are the target of a next generation of therapies called BTK inhibitors. BTK stands for Bruton's tyrosine kinase, and by inhibiting this particular cellular signaling player, The thought is that those microglia in the central nervous system can be adjusted from being pro-inflammatory, causing more damage, to being anti-inflammatory, shutting it off. Can those BTK inhibitors help to douse those cellular players in the nervous system that we think are involved in MS progression? It's a currently unanswered question, but half a dozen companies are running more than half a dozen clinical trials looking at BTK inhibitors, both in relapsing MS and in progressive MS. And the goal there is to say, can these medicines work in the immune system to stop relapses and lesions? We have pretty good evidence from small trials that BTK inhibitors can do that. But we need the large trials to tell us, are those medicines getting into the central nervous system? And within the nervous system, are they slowing down those processes that we think drive progression itself? This is the sort of thing that can't be measured in days or weeks, because the good news, in essence, is MS progression takes a long time. MS progression doesn't happen in days or weeks. It happens over years. And in order to show that these medicines are really preventing it, really slowing it down, one needs controlled trials, and they need to run for 2 or 3 years in order to get us those sorts of answers. So there are trials being done of BTK inhibitors in primary progressive MS. There are other trials being done of BTK inhibitors in primary progressive and secondary progressive disease. We're involved in those studies at Mount Sinai, so I've been overseeing a group of bold and willing participants in controlled trials for progressive MS who are taking that BTK inhibitor or placebo, because these are placebo-controlled trials and we won't know until the end, but they've been taking it. Those trials have been going for a couple of years now, and we will have answers. And so to the MS community and to those of you watching, the progress in MS research can seem excruciatingly slow. And it is. And it's painstaking, and it requires that people are willing to volunteer for studies, not just because they hope that it will benefit them, but because they hope that what we learn from it will help to benefit people who don't yet have progressive MS, or whose MS has not yet progressed, the people in the future. And there's always a balance there in clinical research between trying to get things that will help the people we're taking care of now and get answers about what works that will be enduring, not just for right now, but for the years and decades to come. We're getting there. And so I want to tell the MS community that a lot of people are working very hard on it. A lot of money and resources are being poured into it. And while you invoke your urgency, and we hear you, I also want to point out why it takes so long to get good answers and to ask for patience as we figure it out. The other issue, of course, with clinical trials is figuring out whether a medicine works and also whether a medicine is safe enough. And that also takes a couple of years and typically a couple of thousand people to answer that question. So there are safety issues with these BTK inhibitors that we don't have solved yet. It's caused the FDA to have concerns about them, particularly from the perspective of liver injury. So we're watching that really carefully. So I hope that in a year or thereabouts, maybe a little more than a year, maybe 2 years, Stuart will invite me back and I can talk to you more about the successes that we've had there, but we're not quite there yet. So in the meantime, what can be done for MS progression itself? So this is the last section of what I wanted to make sure I said out loud, and then I'm going to take some questions, but a little bit on this first. What can be done? What should we be doing? And what can all of you do in your own lives to try to address MS progression? So here's a couple of things. One of them is, what can you do with your clinician, with your provider? What should you be asking about and talking about? And I think one of the questions you can pose is simply, Do you think that I am progressing? It's a tough conversation to have, and that's why I said I was going to do this talk without any slides, as though I'm just sitting with you in the office talking it through. But ask your provider, do you think I'm progressing? You know, the clinician may say, well, not in ways that I can see, or no, I don't see anything different. But if you feel that you've gotten worse, think about how to describe it. Are you worse in terms of your stamina, how far you can walk, how long you can go, how far you can go without a cane, or how far you can go without a walker? Are you worse? Do you feel that you've progressed in terms of your energy levels and fatigue, for instance? What is that like? When do you feel it? How often? How many days does fatigue keep you from doing something or some things that you would want to do or feel like you ought to be able to do? If the symptom is cognitive dysfunction, think about how it affects you. Be able to describe it in as detailed a way as you can so that the clinician, the doctor, the nurse practitioner can picture it and can understand it. Does the problem seem to be with memory? Do you forget things? If so, what kind of things? Is the problem with language and finding your words, remembering the names of things or people? Is the problem with attention, multitasking, judgment, that you always feel like you're trying to keep multiple balls in the air mentally and dropping them all? So try to explain what it's like for you. There are ways of assessing cognitive dysfunction that your provider may want to do, computer-based testing, psychology-based testing, questionnaires. But getting some information, some data, is going to be helpful to be a snapshot of where things are. One of the reasons I point all this out is because it is up to the clinician to try to distinguish MS progression from other things. Someone with MS may have profoundly worse fatigue, but not because their MS has progressed, because they have some other reason that the fatigue is worse. Perhaps they've developed sleep apnea. Perhaps they're up at night 10 times to go to the bathroom and they never really get back to sleep. Perhaps they have depression or anxiety and they can't fall asleep. Or they're waking up 4 o'clock in the morning and can't get back to sleep, both of which can be symptoms of depression or anxiety. So there are a lot of reasons why somebody might be more fatigued. There are other lab tests that a clinician might want to pursue. Is someone's thyroid level low? Is their iron level low? Are there other vitamins low? Right? So there's a workup to be done when someone feels this way to help distinguish it from MS progression itself. So those are some examples of how you can come to a visit prepared. Finally, what can you do in your own well-being and lives to help with progression? So here I'm going to invoke my topographical model idea one more time. Imagine the nervous system as a pool of reserve. And it's true that that pool does drain as we get older. All of us lose our reserve as we age. No 80-year-old is capable of what they were capable of when they were 50. And very few 50-year-olds are capable of what they could do when they were 20. So as people get older, we all do lose reserve. But people with MS can lose it faster. And when reserve is lost in multiple sclerosis, sometimes those old lesions start to cause more symptoms. And that's how I think of progression. So if reserve is this ability to compensate that our nervous systems have, the ability to work around damage, ability to find extra resources, I'm going to think in terms of what are the things in your life that drain your reserve, and what are the things that you could do to boost your reserve. Let's have a couple of examples. To come back to the fatigue example, sleep deprivation drains reserve. That's a universal. It can appeal to everyone who's watching this, whether you have MS, whether you love someone with MS, if you've never heard of MS. Being exhausted and sleep deprived takes away our brain's ability to function. So having sufficient restorative sleep is not just important for energy levels, it's important for keeping up reserve, which the brain needs. What else drains reserve? Things that damage the brain that are not MS related also drain its reserve. So I said earlier that the blood-brain barrier helps to keep toxins out of the brain. What is the most common toxin that people in the world and in this country put in themselves? I would say cigarettes. So cigarette smoking literally poisons the central nervous system. It also does damage to the heart and to the blood vessels that supply the brain. And so smoking damages the brain in multiple ways. And anything that damages the brain for someone with MS takes away reserve and makes people progress faster. There is nothing someone with MS can do to alter their trajectory of the disease nearly as much as the treatments themselves as quitting smoking. If someone with MS is smoking, it changes the future for that person. It allows for the brain to be healthier and more restored. It helps to keep the tank of reserve full. What else can people do? So this is where I think physical activity, physical therapy, occupational therapy, going to a gym, walking every day, whatever you feel like you can do, helps to boost reserve by growing connectivity within the nervous system. There is no reason that physical therapy or occupational therapy would help someone with MS if it weren't for the fact that the brain has plasticity. It grows new pathways, it heals, it forges new connections when it is challenged. And so I will quote some of my physical therapy and occupational therapy friends to say, no one with MS, no matter how well they are, shouldn't engage in some physical therapy and physical activity. And no one with MS, no matter how physically limited they are, shouldn't be engaging in some sort of physical therapy, occupational therapy, or physical activity. All through the spectrum. Whatever you can do, I encourage you to do it because it helps to restore brain function, which is what we need. This is also where I think diet helps a great deal. So there's a lot of research, obviously, on diet and MS, and I'm not going to get into it in any real detail here, except to say that a healthy diet, and the one that's been studied the most in particular at our center at Mount Sinai by my colleague, Dr. Alana Katzand, is a Mediterranean-style diet called the MIND diet. If you Google capitals MIND, MIND diet, it's been around for a while, it's been studied in other diseases. Dr. Katzand's work has shown that that diet seems to not only help with patient-reported symptoms and outcomes, but it may also foster brain health, brain volume, which is a great measure for how full and intact someone's brain is. So these are just a few of the things, but the way I like to think of it is while we do the work with disease-modifying therapies to prevent lesions and relapses, and while our field tries to move ahead with targeting cells within the central nervous system that we think are crucial players in progression, these are the things that you can do in your daily lives to keep the tank full. Dietary health, cardiovascular health, exercise, physical therapy, social connectedness, not smoking. And so I will end my unscripted comments there. I don't think I've ever spoken for 40 minutes continuously about a topic with no aid whatsoever, but I'll end my comments there. We're bringing Stuart back to the screen. Stuart, I'd be interested to hear what your thoughts are on what I've said so far, and then we can take some questions.
I am filled with questions for you that I know people are going to want to hear, and I want to let you know that this was one of the better dialogues we've ever had with somebody, especially on this program. But you know, we have all the top docs on this program, and you're definitely included as part of that field. But this has been so engaging. But for many who have not been listening to you or listening to some of the other top MS neurologists in the field to even know what you were talking about with like your topographical model, I feel bad for them. You have your stalagmites or whatever you call them sticking out of the water. You know, we have to create an image for them because you don't have a picture right now. You don't have a drawing. Before I get to that, I would give you a standing ovation if I could but I ruptured tendons in my left leg and I cannot stand up right now. All right. So I'm just going to sit here and I'm going to applaud you for speaking the way you did and say this is wow, a big wow. All right. I am very, very impressed with the way that you laid this all out. So firstly, let's get back to what I just said about your topographical model.
Yeah.
For those that have never seen it, how could you best describe this pool, this leaky pool, this mountainous pool? How do you describe what's the reserved surface and what's sticking out above the surface or what's disappearing below the surface? Please explain all that in a descriptive manner that everybody can see it in their brains.
All right, you got it. Well, here's what I'll say. I mean, Google is helpful. So if somebody really does want to see it with their eyes, in addition to their brain, Google the words Krieger topographical MS, you'll see it. But the principle of the thing is MS causes lesions, and sometimes a lesion causes symptoms that we can all see and recognize, but oftentimes they are under the surface. They're hidden. This is why if you go to your neurologist, you get an annual MRI scan, and they tell you, well, unfortunately, there were 2 new lesions. And you might feel, how could there be new lesions? I didn't know it. I didn't feel anything. And it's because the brain compensates so beautifully for that. They are under the surface, under the threshold. We can't see them. When I first started thinking about the topographical model, I thought about, imagine a lake or a body of water that has a period of time where it's high tide and a period of time where it's low tide. And at low tide, it reveals all sorts of things that you otherwise didn't see. And then at high tide, the water level is higher and it submerges all of that and it's hidden again. And I think in MS, reserve can fluctuate up and down like that over the course of a day or days. Being overheated, overtired, overstressed drains reserve transiently and reveals the damage that's below the surface. And then there's the idea that as time passes, as decades pass, our water levels all drain a little bit. And it reveals, as you said, the stalagmites, these sort of peaks coming up from the bottom of the water. I've referred to them as topographical peaks because it looks like a topographical map of hills and valleys being gradually revealed as that water level drains. So that's kind of how I think of it, that MS is this interplay between the lesions, the damage done, and how much brain reserve is there still to compensate for them. And what we see is above the threshold, but a little bit of that tip of the iceberg phenomenon. There's often a lot more MS under the surface than meets the eye. And it's our job as clinicians to look for it and recognize it and ultimately to try to prevent it.
Thank you. So what focus is there on reducing those stalagmites?
Yeah, so, one of the assumptions that I made when I was coming up with the topographical model is that lesions are essentially forever. They're static. Once a lesion forms, it's a scar. And scars typically don't go away. They typically don't change a lot. Now, I said that there's this more modern approach that's developing where we're looking in more detail at those lesions and seeing that some of them probably are still inflamed and perhaps still growing. But there's also research being done to try to figure out how to fix them, how to take the areas of scar, and if MS is a demyelinating condition where the myelin is damaged, how can we put myelin back on, restore myelin? I think that work has actually gone more slowly than we might have hoped, again, because of the problem that it's hard to get medicines into the nervous system to fix things once they're there. It's easier to prevent damage than it is to repair it. But there is work being done on how to try to shrink lesions down, fix the myelin damage, and if we could do that, then we could do 2 things. We could try to keep the tank full, and we could try to make those peaks melt away, those lesions melt away. But for that, I think we're going to need more than a couple of years to figure out how to do it.
Thank you for that. So another question that I have for you is, when you talked about draining the reserve and sleep deprivation, now not all people are deprived of sleep like others are. I mean, I know
Yeah.
that there are doctors like yourselves, some of which have MS. There are people like me who, 3-4 hours a night is great. So that's right. And I'm still functioning. So how do you explain the difference of somebody that can do that or not do that?
That's a really good question. That question goes obviously beyond just MS to like the architecture of somebody's nervous system and how much sleep they require. I would say if I could have one sort of achievable superpower, I would take having what you've got, which is being able to function on 3 or 4 hours of sleep. Unfortunately, my set point is not there. I need a full night's sleep or I'm not terribly useful the next day. So I don't know the answer to why some people are restored with less sleep than others. And I think, as I said, that goes beyond just MS itself. But I think that sleep deprivation for people with MS is particularly bothersome, particularly damaging for some people. It may not be for you, but in general, the MS brain, the brain for somebody who's fighting MS, has to work harder. It has to use more energy. It has to use more resources to get the signals through. If I'll use a different metaphor for this. If you imagine that you need to drive from one city to another, and you think you got a straight shot, but as you're going, you find there's a road that's closed, so you need a detour. You get to another road that's also closed, now you need another detour. Now there's potholes, so you're snaking around this stuff. By the time you get to where you're going, it took you much longer, you burned a lot more gas, and you've used up a lot of time. And sorry for my phone buzzing there. So
Yeah, really.
in the MS brain, it's got to navigate around all of these potholes, all of these lesions. It's got to use more circuitous routes to get the signals from where they're starting to where they're going. It burns through more energy and it takes more time. And so for someone who is sleep deprived, their tank is running empty. And being sleep deprived makes that all the more difficult.
All right, next person writes, you can explain so well, thank you. So I'm really interested in how you would help me understand the reticular activating system and any suggestions for dealing with damage there. Any insights regarding this is greatly appreciated.
So that's a very specific question, and I probably can't do it complete justice, but briefly, the reticular activating system, I was not expecting anyone to ask about such a thing, but the reticular activating system is a pathway within the brain stem, which is thought to play a crucial role in wakefulness and in maintaining consciousness. So when we are wide awake, our reticular activating system is working and we are conscious. And when we sleep, it's one of the areas that sort of switches off and allows us to be asleep. Now remember, when we're asleep, we still dream, we still think about things, we still process things. So the brain is on, it's working. It's just there's a crucial switch that's turned off so that we're not literally awake. And the reticular activating system is part of that. Presumably lesions from MS that are in the brain stem that could affect the reticular activating system might be implicated in wakefulness and energy levels and things of that nature. I haven't seen a lot of research on it myself. And so I would say if somebody has problems with the reticular activating system, probably they have problems with sleep and wakefulness and energy levels and perhaps that switch between being awake and being asleep. And I would actually defer to sleep medicine doctors who are usually pulmonary doctors, but there are some neurologists that focus on sleep. And maybe the person who asked that question ought to see one of them to see if they can lend some real insight into it.
Okay, thank you. A person wants to know if getting fatigued after a short walk, more so than previously, is considered any kind of progression.
Yeah, so that's a good question. And it was sort of, that was like one of the examples I gave of something that someone might feel and might say in a visit to say, here, this is worsening for me. Do you think it's progression? And I would say that's the kind of symptom that the clinician, the neurologist, needs to really look at and unpack. I'll give you an example. I've had a patient who is, an older person, and they have had progressive MS for a long time, and also described something similar. Well, their walking stamina had decreased. They're tired out after walking a shorter distance, and they thought it was MS progression. I thought it was MS progression. Turns out they had a problem with their aortic valve, and the heart was not pumping the blood effectively, and so they were losing stamina, basically because they were going into heart failure. So it was a really important lesson for me as a clinician, which is not to blame everything on MS. I didn't think I was guilty of that, but I think this was an example where I was too quick to just think it was the MS, and to make sure that a workup is done. So I think if somebody's short of breath or losing stamina after walking a little ways, to take into account, is their heart healthy? Do they have high blood pressure? Do they have diabetes? Could they have coronary disease? Could they have sleep apnea? Could they have other reasons to be winded and fatigued more easily? So I wouldn't just blame the MS, but someone has to think about it.
Could they be older and just out of shape?
Could be. Could be. I mean, if no other cause is found, that's a person who should engage in a physical therapy and occupational therapy program to rebuild some of that stamina, some of that strength to try to push forward. That's what I would say.
Good. Thank you for that. Next one writes, what does primary progression actually mean?
It was seriously part of the question? Like, seriously, what does it mean?
No.
All right. So I would say the following. Primary progressive MS was described as someone who has never had an MS relapse. They've never had optic neuritis. They've never had an episode that lasted for days or weeks of vertigo or numbness or any of the classic things. But something started to go wrong gradually. Typically, it has to do with strength. So someone is sort of gradually limping a little bit, dragging a leg a little bit. Their walking's declining. They go get a workup. Usually someone will see an orthopedist, or they'll think they have a pinched nerve, or they'll get a runaround going from doctor to doctor, but eventually they'll see a neurologist, will get an MRI scan, and lo and behold, there will be lesions there that are classic for MS. Perhaps they'll have a spinal tap, and we'll see the spinal fluid results that are characteristic of MS, so-called oligoclonal bands, which is a way of looking for inflammation in the spinal fluid. And a diagnosis of MS is made. This is a person who never had relapses, but only has this gradual progressive worsening of symptoms. And in my sort of visual language, this is someone whose MS lesions were below the surface. They were invisible. They didn't cross the threshold when they occurred. But now, as that person is aging and their reserve is draining and their brain is shrinking away a bit as we get older, the symptoms of those underlying lesions are gradually surfacing. They're gradually revealing themselves as reserve gets lost. And the things that I said about cells in the nervous system, like microglia or other cells that are sort of fostering this gradual inflammatory damage, may be to blame there. That's why some of the medicines that I talked about being studied, these BTK inhibitors, are being studied in primary progressive MS, because if those medicines target the inflammatory cells that are causing this gradual damage, they might be able to help to switch it off. So my long answer here is primary progressive MS is MS. It's a version where there's just progression, but the relapses weren't so obvious. But I don't think of it as a different disease. I don't think of it as something that shouldn't respond to the treatments that are being developed. And everything that I'm saying about exercise and therapy and boosting reserve apply there as much or perhaps more than to anybody else with MS.
Great, thank you for that. For everybody that's asking questions that relate to you, I can't ask those questions. All right, I can ask anything that's just general. All right, because the doctor may not be your doctor, and if he is, he definitely can't answer because he's got HIPAA laws that he's got to be concerned about. All right, so please just make your questions very general and not about you or your spouse, but more just generalized. Okay. All right, next, you mentioned about EDSS, and a lot of people are wondering what actually does EDSS mean?
Yeah. So the EDSS is what's called, so originally it was the DSS, which stands for the Disability Status Scale. So the E just means it's expanded. So it's an expanded disability status score. And it's a way of gauging how much function has someone with MS started to lose. So when we do a neuro exam, we look for things like strength. So if someone has a weakness, that's going to score them some points on the EDSS. We look for sensation. So people use a tuning fork or a safety pin or other ways of looking at what someone can feel. And if there's loss of sensation or numbness, that's going to score them some points on the EDSS. When you have a neuro exam, you might be asked to have the eyes move around from side to side and smile and puff out your cheeks and feel things. Any damage to any of those things relates to problems in the brain stem, and those things rack up some points on the EDSS. So it's a way of scoring what we see on the physical exam, and that's the way all of our clinical trials were designed, to show whether an MS medicine actually helps or not by whether it can prevent worsening the way we score it on the EDSS.
Okay, thank you for that. All right, another thing that you spoke about early on was patient-reported outcomes. Can you give an actual example about one of these outcomes?
Sure. So patient-reported outcomes are usually scales. They're basically a series of survey questions that people fill out that gives us some data. It's a way of saying, if someone, like the earlier point, someone feels more fatigued after they walk a certain distance. Right? So there are scales that can be used to capture fatigue. And so one of them is something called the Modified Fatigue Impact Scale, the MFIS. And it's going to ask questions just like that. Does someone feel, fatigue after they walk, or does the fatigue interfere with certain types of functions? I forget how many questions it is. It's like dozens of questions to try to put some quantified answers to the sort of thing that you might come to an office and talk about. There are quality of life indicators. So there are some MS-specific symptom inventories that look at a whole host of things, from physical symptoms to emotional symptoms, energy levels, pain, etc. Kind of sum those all together, and we get a score on a particular inventory. So many of the clinical trials that are being done now, including those of the BTK inhibitors, not only have things like the EDSS, which is the exam that the neurologist does, but it also has these patient-reported outcomes, quality of life indicators, functional status, fatigue scales, things of that nature, to try to put some real lived experience to the data.
Thank you. Another thing that you asked, or not that you asked, but that you were speaking about before, and people don't understand what that is you said something about siponimod. Which medicine is siponimod? That's the pharmacological code. Now tell us what the brand is.
It's true. I'm so used to, whenever we do talks for, to neurologists or to other people in the community, we never give promotional talks. So we never promote a drug. We never sell a drug, ever. Sure. Even if I give a talk that a company has supported, I'm still not out there talking about their drug by name. So we always use the official names of the drugs and never the brand name. But I'm sorry, you're right. I probably should have actually just gone ahead and said brand names and talking about these drugs. So I only mentioned a couple of them. I mentioned ocrelizumab, which was studied in primary progressive MS. That drug is called Ocrevus. And I mentioned siponimod, which was studied in secondary progressive MS. That drug is called Mayzent.
Okay, great. Thank you for that. All right, next thing. Hey, everybody, I'm going to get to your questions as long as they're not general, right? But I've got to go through this list first. You spoke about stem cell treatments and the wiping out of the immune system and how that does not benefit with progressive forms of MS. How then or why then was Lemtrada introduced to treat progressive forms of MS if that too wiped out the immune system?
Oh, so that's an interesting question. So Lemtrada, or alemtuzumab, is a very powerful immune suppressing drug. It was originally created as a type of chemotherapy drug, repurposed for multiple sclerosis. And that drug knocks out T cells and B cells, so those lymphocytes, which we think are quite responsible for MS disease activity. Alemtuzumab, or Lemtrada, was studied in trials of relapsing MS. These were called the CARE-MS2 trial, or CARE-MS trials, looking at relapsing MS for people who'd been on medicines, relapsing MS for folks who hadn't been on medicines. It was not studied in progressive multiple sclerosis. And that was a calculation on the part of the company developing it, because I think they thought it would be most effective for people with relapsing MS because of how it worked. And so that drug was never went through trials for primary progressive or secondary progressive MS. And so it wasn't ever approved for primary or secondary progressive MS. It was only approved for relapsing remitting MS. Now, you know, I have never used that medicine in people who just have progression. I've used it for people with active inflammatory relapsing MS, and I do think that it helps to shut that down. But I don't think that we know that it helps for progression, for the same reason that I don't think that stem cell transplants with chemotherapy and then stem cells necessarily helps for people with progression. I actually think that alemtuzumab, Lemtrada, is a good example of how no matter how hard we hit the inflammatory part in the bloodstream, it doesn't necessarily solve the problem inside the brain and spinal cord.
Okay. Thank you for that. Tell us about active SPMS. You didn't speak about that, but if you can, please. I don't think you spoke about that.
I didn't say it explicitly, no, but what I said is that secondary progressive MS often has both progression, which is gradual, and also disease activity like relapses. It can have both. And what we call active SPMS is someone who has had progression. Let's say they need a, but they still have relapses or they still have new lesions when we get MRI scans done. I have a patient who's in her 70s who I didn't think was likely to ever have a new relapse or a new lesion. And we did an MRI scan just to check her out and found a brand new lesion that was absolutely not there the last time we did the scan 2 years ago. MS surprises us, right? It doesn't always behave as expected. And that's a good example of someone who has evidence of progression, but sure enough, that was disease activity. So that would be active secondary progressive MS. In essence, it means it's still relapsing. So it means our medicines that prevent relapses and prevent lesions may do a particularly good job there.
Great, thank you. All right, so you spoke about active secondary. What about just secondary MS? What can you say about SPMS?
Well, in essence, that was sort of everything I was saying, and this whole program kind of relates to secondary progressive MS. And this is, again, just the idea that even when the relapses stop happening, even when someone's not having any more new lesions, as they get older, lose some reserve, the brain is atrophying away, that underlying damage can gradually worsen over time. Let me put it this way, though. Someone who's had MS for many years, who let's say had a relapse where her right leg and foot was weak. So for a period of time, she couldn't walk so well, couldn't wear heels, needed steroids. It got better. The relapse recovered. But sometimes that kind of relapse always leaves behind a little bit of weakness where it was. So maybe that person's right foot was never quite as quick as the left. The right foot would catch a little bit. The toes sometimes catch on the stairs. At the end of a long day or at the end of a lot of exertion, that right leg and foot feels a little heavy. What secondary progression is when that starts to worsen. And then it's not just a subtle little bit of weakness or slowness of that right foot, but it's a more pronounced right foot drop. And then it's not just the right foot, but the whole leg kind of feels heavy and has to be swung around a little bit. And then the person might need a cane to help them navigate. That type of gradual unfolding or gradual surfacing of that old symptom, that's what we think of as the development of secondary progressive MS.
Okay, thank you for that. Changing subjects a little bit, talking about all these great medications that have been on the market, and then the companies lose their what do you call it for it? Whatever, you know what I'm saying, but they become a generic.
Yeah.
Why are we not promoting those generics as like Tecfidera? We'll just use that as an example since that's most active right now. So Tecfidera is no longer a brand. It's now, I mean, you can get the brand, but your insurances do not want to pick it up. They want you to take a generic. And what can you say about the generic? I mean, is it as good as the brand? And why is it then become totally inaccessible for those, not totally inaccessible, but financially inaccessible then for those that were benefiting from getting the brand because they were on a government insurance such as Medicaid or Medicare? What do we do and what do we say for those that have to give up using that brand for financial reasons because of that? How do you steer them?
Yeah, so related problems. Let me tell you the good news first, and then I'll tell you the bad news. So the good news is, I think fundamentally, the generic versions of the brand medicines that we've been using for many years are fine. The first one that ever happened was generic Copaxone, which was glatiramer acetate, quite a number of years ago now. It did its work. Copaxone was never the most powerful drug out there, but I don't think that the generic glatiramer acetate was any less effective, or at least doesn't seem to have been the case over these last many years. We then had generics for Tecfidera, which is dimethyl fumarate. I'm not a biochemist, but evidently that drug is not a difficult molecule to make. I've known one biochemist person who basically said that she could synthesize it in her bathtub if she wanted to. I did not encourage her to make drugs in her bathtub, but in principle, it's not difficult, evidently, for companies to manufacture a generic version of the fumarates, like dimethyl fumarate. And over these last couple of years, certainly, I don't see in my own practice that drug didn't work as well as the original brand name Tecfidera. We now have generics for Gilenya, which is fingolimod, the first oral medicine. That went generic, I don't know, a year or so ago. One of the more comforting things about that is one can do a blood test for somebody on Gilenya or generic fingolimod and see that it's having the effect on the lymphocytes that we want it to. The lymphocyte count on that drug should be low. That's what it does. It hides the lymphocytes. So the lymphocyte count on the routine blood test should be low. So as I've had many patients switched from brand name to generic Gilenya to fingolimod, we look at the blood work, and indeed, the lymphocyte count stays low. It stays exactly where we would expect and want it to be, which is another way of knowing that the generic drug is doing in the body what it's supposed to do. Soon, we will have not a generic, but a biosimilar for an infused medicine called Tysabri. We'll have a biosimilar of the generic, in essence, infusion, which is natalizumab. We don't have that one yet, but we'll see if that one also maintains the efficacy of the original brand. So the good news is, I think that these work. The bad news is what you pointed out, Stuart, which is that when someone is switched from a brand name drug to a generic, they lose whatever company support was being put behind the brand. So when Gilenya was out, Novartis paid for the co-pays for Gilenya and startup materials for Gilenya with their patient support program. Once someone is on a generic, that all goes away, because now the company that made the original is not making the thing that the person is getting, and there's no support there. And indeed, the companies then lose interest in their original brand, and so then the company stops providing the support for the brand because everyone's on the generic. Same thing with Gilenya, same thing with Tecfidera, and we'll see about other ones. So that can be a real problem for people on government insurance who they can't get company support. And now if the copay is high, there's nothing that can be done about it. And so that has been a real problem. That is a problem with the US healthcare system in general. And that problem is made worse by the fact that our medicines in MS are A, expensive, and B, they're forever. That is to say, it's not like you take an MS drug for a year and then you're done. You take an MS drug for as long as you need to take it, maybe many years. And so this has been a huge financial problem in our field. I don't have a good solution for it. But in general, if someone has to be switched back to a branded drug in order to get copay support, that can be done. If somebody is on government insurance, that gets even harder because even the companies can't provide copay support. If someone is on government insurance and the government insurance doesn't pay for it all. So that is a distinctly American healthcare problem. I wish I had a clear and quick answer for it, but that would require an enormous amount of regulatory and probably political changes.
I got it. I'm on Health Equity Council, so I totally understand what's going on here, okay? All right, I have one more question for you, and then we're going to delve back into all those that are online. And the question that I have for you is regarding the BTK inhibitor race. What are the differences that are showing from the different pharmaceuticals, why one may favor more than another, and the way that the FDA is looking at these?
So, you know what, I'm going to punt that question into 2024 because we're not really going to have an answer to it until the studies are done. All the studies are still going, and until the studies are finished, we don't have the data at all. It is one of those things that you don't know how it looks until it's done. You can't check the pot before it's done. So I don't know the answer yet. That's the short answer. The first one, which is something called evobrutinib, EVO's trials should start to read out data at the end of this calendar year, maybe early in the new year. That'll be the first signal we get, and then the other ones will follow over the next year or so to come.
Sure. Thank you for that. I'm throwing away these pages. I'm going to get into what others are asking, all right? I got to try to figure some of these out because some of them have them a little bit too personal, and I'm going to ask them more generic, okay? And so a person wants to know if hydration is a factor in getting worse or not getting worse.
Yeah, that's a good question. Probably, dehydration, especially on a hot day or a summer day, a day when the heat, of course, makes MS worse, makes it feel worse. Dehydration only compounds that. So I do think that staying hydrated is important to maintain brain perfusion and brain health, especially in the hot months. I don't know that dehydration itself necessarily worsens MS progression per se, but staying hydrated is important. And I tell everybody with MS that I take care of, particularly in the summer heat, stay hydrated with a cold beverage. So if you're going to be out and you know it's going to be hot, have a thermos or something full of ice with a liquid or water beverage in it so that you can actually be drinking something genuinely cold. That way you'll stay hydrated and it'll also help to keep down core temperature.
Okay, thank you for that. Next one wants to know if taking classes, being more active like in college style classes, is that better to help slow down brain atrophy?
That's a great question. I mean, I don't have clinical trial level data for it, so I don't want to tell you, yes, everyone watching should go sign up for a whole bunch of college courses if that's not how you want to spend your time. But I do think, and I think I said it, a version of it, is that the brain develops plasticity and the brain develops new connections when it is challenged. So learning something new is a very good way to challenge your cognitive and mental resources to try to forge new connections. Learning something new, learning a new skill, very difficult when we get to a certain age. We're not designed to learn things so well when we're older than when we were younger. This is why school happens when we're kids, because that's when our brain is actually learning how to do things. But if you can take a class, learn a skill, study a language, be engaged in that way, I think that's probably much more valuable than just like doing puzzles, you know, doing brain teasers or something like that, which is very sort of inward looking. It's not really outward looking and learning new things and engaging with the world.
Gotcha, thank you. All right, next one writes, do you believe that the process that leads to progression in secondary progressive is the same as progression in primary progressive? And if so, does that suggest that a drug for secondary PPMS to minimize progression should also work?
Great question. I don't think anybody knows the answer definitively. So I don't think there's consensus in our field as to whether primary progressive and secondary progressive fundamentally are the same processes. But I'll tell you what I think. What I think is they're the same thing. They're the same thing. Pathologically, they seem the same. On imaging, they seem the same. What little genetics can help to parse these things out seems the same. The spinal fluid looks the same. In my heart, I don't think that these are fundamentally different things. And so, yes, in that case, I do think that things that work for progression should work for progression, whether we call it primary or secondary progressive MS, but that is not how the trials have been designed. It's not how the FDA has made their determinations. There's not real consensus about it in our field. But you asked me what I thought. That's what I think.
Great, thank you for that. For everybody that's written in all their kudos about what an informative discussion this is, I'm going to say thank you, but I'm not going to read each one individually. And Dr. Krieger already knows how good he is, so I'm not going to keep building up his bubble over there, all right? But
I mean, it's nice to hear it. We all need a little positive affirmation in our lives.
Of course you do. Of course you do. All right. So this person writes, yes, thank you for an informative share and for all you're doing to change the game. Would love to hear your perspective on whether inflammatory foods, including dairy, contribute to progression and if supplements can play a role.
Oh, yeah, that's a good question. So, when I talked about the role of diet in MS, my quick summary was, eat a diet that's sort of positive brain health, mostly from a cardiovascular perspective, because I think that is where diet can be so damaging to the brain. If our blood glucose is always high and our fat levels and saturated fat are high and obesity can be toxic for the brain. So I kind of think of it more from a cardiovascular perspective. Your question is about the anti-inflammatory qualities of diet. I think that is less certain to me, but there's a lot of people who've done a lot of work looking at that, relating to pro-inflammatory foods versus non-inflammatory foods, the effect on the gut microbiome and the effect on the immune system. I don't know the answer. My view is sort of that what really drives progressive inflammation is happening on the brain side of the blood-brain barrier. And I don't know that the foods that we eat, which affect the circulating systemic inflammation, really affect that so directly. That said, almost every diet that's been studied in a healthful way for MS, like the MIND diet, avoids a lot of pro-inflammatory foods. So I think if you are going to cut anything out, cut out processed food, cut out things with unpronounceable 12-syllable ingredients, which were not things that we were designed to eat. But I don't, with my own patients, take a particularly hard stance on avoiding things like dairy, which I don't think avoiding that is necessarily for everybody. But you do have to find a diet that suits the balance of what you enjoy, what's healthful, and what seems to be good for the brain.
Okay, thank you for that. Next, for patients who have developed, I'm going to screw up this word, lymphocytopenia from Lemtrada, Ocrevus, etc., what new medications are recommended if MS is still active?
Yes, that's a tough one because that requires knowing a lot about the particular person in order to really answer that. But lymphopenia is when the lymphocytes are low. Now, with a medicine like Gilenya, fingolimod, lymphopenia is to be expected. We know that's going to happen. With a medicine like Lemtrada, lymphopenia is to be expected because that drug kills lymphocytes. That's what it does. With other medicines, lymphopenia is not expected. It's not okay. So, for instance, with Tecfidera, dimethyl fumarate, lymphopenia should not happen, and when it does, it's a problem. So it depends a lot on what the patient was on, what their lymphocyte count is, and what their disease process looks like. But if that were to happen, someone's lymphopenic, they have low lymphocytes, and they still have MS disease activity, they do need to be on a medicine. It should just be a medicine that doesn't cause lymphopenia, and we have them. You have to ask your doctor, though.
Okay, thank you. This one writes, it's like all hieroglyphics to me, but what are your thoughts on CMAU8?
I don't know what that is.
That's good. That's good. Well, the person asked that, and I asked them to describe that because I wanted to be able to read it in layman English, but I can see that we're stuck here, so I'll just pass on that one and go to the next.
Next time we'll do that.
Thank you. Why do DMTs for relapsing MS, such as Copaxone, also have indication for a secondary progressive MS?
So the FDA made a decision that medicines for relapsing MS can be used for secondary progressive MS if there's still evidence of relapses. What they're basically saying is whether or not someone has had progression, if they have relapses, if they have new lesions, disease activity, then all the medicines for relapsing MS can still be used. They're likely to still be helpful. So that's the position that the FDA took. So most of our medicines are approved for relapsing MS, including secondary progressive MS with activity, which is another way of saying people who still have relapses. So as long as someone's still having relapses or disease activity, most of our medicines are approved for them, including Copaxone.
Okay, thank you. And another thing about Copaxone, if patients are using medications such as Copaxone without any relapse, what do you tell them? I mean, there are many doctors that are trying to get everybody onto all these new medications, but what do you tell a person who is still doing well from Copaxone?
Usually, if somebody is still doing well from Copaxone, it means several things. One, they've done really well, so it's hard to argue with success. Number two, they chose Copaxone for a reason, or they and their neurologist chose it for a reason, to avoid risk, to use a simple medicine. Perhaps there were other complicating factors, comorbidities, and that's why they chose it. So if something is working and it is not causing a person harm, and I can detect no failure of that drug, I don't necessarily take somebody off of it and put them on something else. Right. That's success. It just means we have to look carefully. I'm going to bring it back to the progression piece. It just means that we have to look carefully to make sure that we're not missing signs of progression. I don't want to keep somebody on a drug thinking that they're doing well, only because I haven't been looking carefully at them enough to realize that they're not doing so well. So as long as that person is getting attentive care and they don't feel like they're worsening, and their neurologist doesn't think that they're worsening, they're on Copaxone and it's working, I'll leave it there.
Some of the people are possibly on Copaxone or Avonex or Betaseron from 30 years ago or 25 years ago, and they're doing well with it. So I guess you have to just leave them where they are, right?
You do. Well, I don't know how many more questions you have. We've taken it all the way out to after 8:30. I didn't think that
we have 4 or 5 more. All right, I'm going to ask everybody to stop sending questions because if you do, I'm not going to read it. If you do, I'm not going to read it anyway. So So I'm just
All
going
right.
to get to these final ones here. And another one in Copaxone. Copaxone does cross the BBB, and that's a brain-blood barrier, and acts as a decoy. Please address the effectiveness of this mechanism of action.
It doesn't do its work by crossing the blood-brain barrier. It does its work by acting as a decoy, principally in the circulation, in the immune system. So it's not really doing its work in the brain so much. It did, however, work well enough to prevent a modest amount of relapses, which for some people is sufficient. But it is certainly, amongst the least highly effective, the non-highly effective medicines that we have. So if someone is having breakthrough disease, it probably needs to change.
Great, thank you. All right, next, going back to that CuAU8, this is a nano gold particle thing.
Cool. I now know what we're talking about. So yeah, the gold nano, I just didn't recognize the acronym. The gold nanoparticle thing is very interesting. It's a few years away from being ready for prime time, but it is a neat way of trying to get something that's so small across the blood-brain barrier in a way that might be beneficial. I'm intrigued by it. We haven't done the studies in our own place, but I've read about them. Let's see where it goes. But it makes use of the idea that you need something to be very small in order to get across the blood-brain barrier, and nothing says small like the words nanoparticle.
That's right. That's right. That's correct. So going back again to the ABCs, if a person is still doing one of those medications and they have not had any additional lesions since starting that medication, do you think that they should remain or use something stronger?
Well, I think it does vary person to person. But again, if someone has achieved the goal, that is to say, no evidence of disease activity, right? NEDA, no relapse, no lesion, no progression. Someone's achieved the goal. I will probably continue the medicine that has allowed them to achieve the goal, unless it's making them miserable. If somebody's on Avonex after 20 years and they'd really rather not inject themselves with interferon once a week, I respect that. And then there's other options, of course, to explore.
Great, thank you for that. Two more questions. One being, if a person tested JC positive long ago and is still testing very small, tighter numbers, are they any more susceptible to get PML, or should they stay the course and listen to their doctor?
Yeah, that's a very individualized question. So I'm going to sort of not answer it, except to say the following. The way the studies of PML risk in Tysabri were done, because this only applies to Tysabri. These JC virus antibody numbers don't have the same sort of meaning in terms of PML risk for any of the other medicines. So I'm going to assume that this person is on Tysabri. If someone is on Tysabri, the way the data was done about PML risk, if they were positive, JC positive at any time, they were considered positive. And so then they have the risk of PML associated with being JC positive. So the nuance is about, well, it was only positive once and then it went down and then it's low. I'm reassured by it a little bit, but if we're going by the numbers, they've acquired the risk of PML because they've demonstrated that they carry that virus. I don't typically keep people on Tysabri for a very long time unless I have a compelling reason in that setting. So I would defer to that person's doctor and to them, because you can make that argument both ways. But I do want them to understand that if they were JC positive at any point, their body has seen that virus, they do have more of a PML risk than if they were negative the whole time.
So even if their titer numbers are low, like as I was told, 0.3 or lower, versus somebody that's 1 point or 2.0,
yeah,
what are they to feel?
It's a really nuanced question, and it would require more info than I could hope to have about the anonymous person asking. But they need to have a real conversation with their neurologist about it. I mean, really, like, put them to task and say, like, listen, what are my PML risk numbers? Like, what do you think my annual risk of developing PML is, and is it worth it? Because let's face it, we do have 15 other medicines now. Tysabri is not the only highly effective medicine we have. It's just the only one that causes PML in any significant way for people who are JC positive.
Right. Thank you for that. Last question. I'll try to figure this one out. Person writes, as you said, the benefits of medications with this disease are in general modest in efficacy. At what point would more invasive procedures be considered? Tap right into the brain.
Yeah, so good question. Neurologists, generally speaking, don't want anyone or anything to tap into people's brains if we don't have to, but I understand the rationale there. If we were going to have to give a medicine directly to the brain, which would require direct access to the central nervous system, either via lumbar punctures or a shunt or a neurosurgical procedure, we'd have to be pretty damn sure that that medicine is going to work when it gets there. Right? If I'm going to put somebody through that kind of risk, that kind of discomfort, that kind of harm, the data for that agent doing the work that we needed to do in the brain has got to be very, very compelling. I haven't seen that yet, not for anything. So the route of administration is part of it. How do we get it there? But then what does it do when it gets there is really essential. So I would not encourage in this moment in 2023, I would not encourage anyone with MS to have any sort of procedure that would put anything into their nervous system, because we don't have anything that we know of yet that's going to do the job when it's there. And that person then takes on all the risk and none of the benefit. And that's not a good trade-off right now. So it's a somewhat negative response, but I think the work needs to be done. This is why we need the trials. I would say to that person, if a clinical trial becomes available where they're going to infuse or inject a medicine via spinal taps or shunts, if that's something that you would be willing to explore, even if it might not benefit you, but it might benefit the next generation. If we learn something, then go for it. But it should be done under the setting of a trial so that we as a field can learn from that so that we can bring those insights to you and to others. But I wouldn't want anyone to go and get a procedure like that now.
Okay, thank you for that. So we have learned again that, like the clothing store line Size Sims, I don't know if you ever heard of them, but they always said that an educated consumer is our best customer, and we show that every time we do one of these programs. So I will grab that tagline and I will say thank you for everybody for being online. We did have quite a large audience tonight, and Dr. Krieger, I cannot thank you enough for being here to answer these questions, to give your talk, because that was phenomenal, and you should definitely not give it up. All right, and definitely go forward with just doing this with the way that you did it tonight. It was fabulous.
Well,
all right,
I appreciate that. Stuart, thank you. And listen, I want to thank you for what you do. This is the kind of conversation I might have with one person in my office, maybe not for an hour and a half, but one person, and you have a platform where we can reach a lot of people. So I appreciate you, and thank you for having me on.
Great, thank you for that. All right, Doc, thank you again. Go have dinner. Say goodnight. Bye-bye.